Hi chess players. Today's video is going to be on check and checkmate, and we're going to look at several examples and discuss some different things. So first I'd like to start off with what checkmate is. Checkmate is the winning move in chess and is our ultimate goal, and it means that the king will be threatened in a way that he cannot stop that threat. So first let's take a look at an example of a check and discuss some ways that a king can possibly get out of check. If white moves their rook to d8 and lines it up with the king, this is an example of check. Check means a piece is threatening to capture the king. So notice that the rook is lined up with the king in the way it moves, and this king is in check, or I like to describe it as danger. So when a player is in check, that player must get out of check if possible. If there is no way for the king to get out of check, then that will be checkmate, and that is the game-winning move. So there are three possible ways to get out of check. And we're going to look at a few examples now, and then also look at some checkmates. So we definitely see that the king is in danger. The rook has the king in check. One way to get out of check is to simply move the king to a safe square. If the king moves to g7, now it is no longer being threatened by the rook, and that king is out of check. That's one way. Notice the king couldn't move left or right because that king would still be in check, and that is considered an illegal move. So another way to get out of check is to put a piece in between the piece that has the king in check and the king. For example, black could block with the bishop, and that would be one way to get out of check because the rook may not jump over to capture the king. That would be an example of getting out of check by blocking. Another example of blocking would be to move the knight to f8 and block with the knight. Notice there is no longer a check because the knight is blocking the rook's path to the king. And the third way to get out of check, and one of my favorite ways, is to simply capture the piece that has you in check if possible. So when the rook moved to d8, check, notice the knight has the option of capturing the rook. And after the knight were to capture the rook, well, obviously this king is no longer in check because the piece that had him in check was captured, and the game will continue. So the three ways to get out of check are to move out of check, or to block the check, or to capture the piece that has you in check. So we're all going to be in check at some point in our chess careers. So really important to be able to see all the ways to get out of check, because sometimes there's a better option than others. In this case, capturing the rook looks to be the best option for black. Okay, now let's take a look at some examples of checkmate. Okay, in this position, like in the last position, if the rook moves all the way down, this rook has the king in check. It is threatening the king, and when we would make this move, we would tell our opponent check. As soon as we move our piece and line it up with the king, we would tell that player check. And they would try to get out of check by moving, blocking, or capturing. The issue in this position is the king has nowhere to move, because if he moves left, it's still check. If he moves right, it's still check. And because his pawns are in front of him, there is nowhere to move forward, and this king simply cannot move out of check. Also, there is no way for black to block the check because there is no piece that he can move to f8 or e8 and put in between the king and the rook. And lastly, there's not a way for black to capture this rook, so the king is in check, and there is no way for that king to get out of check, and white would win this game by checkmate. In chess, we don't physically capture the king. We threaten the king or check him in a way that he cannot get out of check or cannot stop the threat of check, and this is the game-winning move, and we have checkmate. In this case, white would win due to checkmate. And if it were black to move in this position, black also has a move that will lead to checkmate, and that is to move their rook all the way to the end and put the white king in check. Now, it's not checkmate this move, but it certainly will be next move. How can white stop the checkmate for one move at least? So feel free to pause your video. Which way can white get out of check? Can he move, block, or capture to stop the threat for one move anyway? And the answer is white can block the check by moving the rook backwards and get out of check for one move. Unfortunately, this would still lead to checkmate after rook captures rook, check, and like in our last example, this king simply has nowhere to move to, no way to block, and no way to capture the piece that has him in check, and this would be checkmate for the black pieces. And these are both examples of back rank checkmate. So, very common checkmate, and a little bit of advice that I give to my students is always look for checks because it could be checkmate. Not to say that every check is a great move, but we should always be looking for checks because our goal is to checkmate our opponent. Okay, let's take a look at another example. In the last example, black was in check and couldn't move anywhere to get out of check because the pawns that were in front of the king. Well, now there are no pawns in front of the king, but we're going to see another example of checkmate. In this position, rook to b8 puts the king in check, and there is, again, nowhere for this king to move, and this king may not move forward, even though there aren't pawns there. One of white's rooks is controlling the entire 7th rank. So this king may not move forward because that would put that king in check. In chess, you are not allowed to move into check or stay into check. You must get out of check if possible. And any square that this king moves to will be check with either the rook on the 7th rank, or if they were to stay on the back row, it would still be check with the rook on the 8th rank. So this is an example of two pieces being used to put the king in checkmate. One piece is doing the checking, the other piece is taking away all the escape squares for the king, and that king has nowhere to move, and in this case, no piece to block with, and no way to capture one of the opposing rooks. And I've heard this example called the rook roller. This can be used to chase a king to the edge of the board. For example, check with the rook. This king may not move forward because of the other rook. It must go in a backwards direction, and white will simply give chase by moving one of the rooks, check, and keeping the other rook controlling the line in front of the king, and eventually this king will get put into checkmate. Check. And this is kind of a tricky position. White doesn't want to move their rook down and put the king in check because it would simply get captured by the king. So what they will do is simply swing their rook to the other side of the board, and king here attacking the rook, and we will simply swing this rook over, and after the king moves to one square or the other, remember, he may not move forward because of the rook controlling the rank, and after the king moves over, we're going to see a similar checkmate with the rooks being on the other side of the board. Check, nowhere to move, this king is in checkmate. Okay. Let's take a look at another example of checkmate. And in this position, it will be white to move. And there is a winning move for the white pieces. And again, my advice to all chess players, but in particular newer chess players, is to make sure you look for checks. And not all checks will look like a good move initially, but they should at least be considered. And the check for the white pieces in this position is queen captures pawn on g7. Putting the king in check because the queen is lined up with the king in a way that she moves. And there is simply no way for this king to get out of check. And the most logical looking move for black is, why may I not capture the queen? My king moves one square, but the issue is this would put the king in check by the bishop way over here on a1. So when we moved our queen to g7, we knew that she would be protected by the bishop on a1. So we have an example of one piece checking the king and another piece giving protection to the queen that's doing the checking. And again, this king has nowhere to move. Any square that he moves would still be check. And there's no way to block when the piece that's checking is directly in front of or next to or diagonal to the king. So no way to block, and there's no way to capture the king. There's no way for black to capture the queen on g7 because the king may not do it. It would put him in check. So again, we see a nice example of checkmate. And I like to call this the helper checkmate because the queen couldn't do it alone. She needs the help of the bishop. For example, if the bishop were not on the board and we played our queen to g7 check, the king could simply capture that piece. Okay, moving on. Let's see here. And the next position we're going to look at is an endgame where white has a king and two pawns and black has a lone king. And again, keep your eyes open to checks because they might be checkmate or they might lead to checkmate. And feel free to pause your video. It is white to move and checkmate in one move. Can you find the checkmate for the light pieces? And the checkmate for white is simply pushing the pawn forward one, and this game is over by checkmate because the pawn on d7 has the king in check because pawns capture or threaten to capture diagonally one square, and this king has nowhere to move and no way to block and no way to capture. For example, the king may not capture the pawn because that would put the king in check by the other king. Kings can never be next to each other because you can never move in to check when you're playing chess. The other possible squares are the king moving over. This would be check with the e pawn. And if the king moved over this way, again, check with the e pawn. And the last possible square is f7. And again, a king may not move next to another king because that would put that king in check. So we have an example of checkmate with two pawns and a king, and this game would be over and white would win by checkmate. Important to note that in this position, if it were not white's move, if it were black's move, well, we have an example of stalemate. And stalemate is when a player has no legal moves, but they're not in check. What I mean is, if it's black to move, the king simply has nowhere to go because he would have to move into check by one of white's pieces. And this player would have no legal moves, but they're not in check, and we call this a stalemate. And the result of a stalemate is much different than a checkmate. Checkmate means that one player wins. Stalemate is what we call a draw. And a draw is a tie in chess. And if it were black's move, this would be a stalemate, and it would be a draw, and that means it's a tie. So this is important because a common misconception I see with younger players is that if someone doesn't have a square to move, they think that that is checkmate and the other player wins. Well, in this position, if it's black to move, white does not win. This is a draw, and if they were in a chess tournament, that 1 point for a win would be split between the two players. Each would get a half a point, and it's a draw. So a different result other than a checkmate is a stalemate. And if it were black to move in this position, we would have a stalemate. Okay. Let's look at one more position before we wrap up. Okay. Knight here. Okay, white to move, and there is a checkmate in one move. So feel free to pause the video, see if you can find the checkmate. And if you would just like to watch and enjoy, the checkmate for the white pieces is to move the knight to f7 and put the king in check. Notice the knight moves 1, 2, 3. This king is in check and has nowhere to move to get out of check because the black pieces surrounding the king are preventing the king from moving anywhere. And this is an example of what's called smothered mate. One piece is doing the checking, and normally this black king would be able to simply move somewhere to get out of check, but because their own pieces are surrounding the king, there is simply nowhere to move, and we have an example of smothered mate with a knight. I think that's a pretty cool checkmate. And again, since the king is in check and there is no way out, white would win this game by checkmate. So that was a few examples of checkmate, and there are many, many more. So again, my advice is to look for checks and then ask yourself, can that player get out of check by moving, blocking, or capturing? And if they cannot, you might be able to win the game by checkmate. So I hope you'll give some of these checkmates a try, and also stay tuned for more videos on checkmate because there are a lot of checkmates, and I'm looking forward to bringing you all a lot more of these in the coming weeks. So thanks for tuning in, and I will see you guys next time.